The year 2009 was the 200th anniversary of the birth of Charles Darwin. Also represented the 150th anniversary of his famous book, The Origin of Species. I want us to answer a simple question. Was Darwin wrong? You know, during my lifetime, Charles Darwin has been elevated to the status almost of a god. He is proclaimed as one of the greatest scientist minds. And yet, what is the truth regarding his theory? What is the truth regarding what is being taught in textbooks today? Time and time again, young people are running off to school. They're being immersed in this idea. Charles Darwin, Darwinian evolution, natural selection. I want us to spend just a few minutes looking at exactly what his theory entails, who this man was, and what is the truth. Was he really a god? Most individuals don't know that when Charles Darwin was roughly 8 years of age, his mother passed away. That meant that his father, his grandfather, both of whom were physicians, they played a key role on shaping Charles Darwin's life. It was expected that Charles Darwin would follow in their footsteps, that he too would be a physician. So they sent him off to Edinburgh University at the tender age of 16, where he studied medicine. This was back in the day before anesthesia, back before patients would commonly be put under to have surgery. So part of a physician's training was holding down a patient as a surgeon would cut them open to try to figure out what was going wrong. Quite literally, Charles Darwin could not hack it. The screams, the blood were far too much for him to stomach. He called his dad and basically let him know that this wasn't working out. In order to save face, his dad realized there was really only one particular career choice that would save the family name: a priest. Charles Darwin was packed up from Edinburgh. He was taken to Cambridge University, where he studied, of all things, divinity. The one thing that most scientists don't recognize or are not willing to admit, the only formal training Charles Darwin ever received was actually in theology. He studied the Bible. While he was there at Cambridge, he ran into a man, John Stephen Henslow, who was a priest, but he also spent a lot of time as a botanist. He loved collecting plants. Charles Darwin would oftentimes, he would go out on nature walks with him. They would collect things. Henslow realized Charles Darwin had a knack for collecting. And upon his graduation from Cambridge, Henslow got Charles Darwin a voluntary job on a boat known as the HMS Beagle. It was supposed to be roughly a 2-year journey. It ended up being 5 years. Charles Darwin's job was to collect all kinds of specimens, to bring them back, to catalog them. On that 5-year journey, he learned two very valuable things. Number one, he learned that he was not cut out for life at sea. He spent most of the time seasick. Number two, he learned that he did have a knack for collecting specimens, collecting things. Charles Darwin boards the boat. Every time they touched land, he wanted to get off because of his seasickness. They make the trip down around the southern tip of Africa, around the southern tip of South America. And as they cruise up the western coast of South Africa, they head out into the waters, roughly 500 miles off the coast of Ecuador. They come across a group of islands. A group of islands that we today call the Galapagos Islands. And it was there that Charles Darwin made a discovery that would change his life. Several months back, a friend of mine, Mark Teskey, and I, we had an opportunity to travel to the Galapagos Islands. We were able to literally walk in the footsteps of Charles Darwin, to see some of the amazing creatures that he saw. Animals that quite literally you will only find on those islands. For instance, those marine iguanas. Marine iguanas that will swim around and then they will literally cough up the salt that they've been swallowing. or those massive Galapagos turtles, or the blue-footed boobies, those birds with the bright blue feet. Loads and loads of amazing animals. Animals that Charles Darwin actually called pre-flood, antediluvian, he said in his book. It was on that particular trip that he stumbled across roughly 13 finches. Today, those finches go by the name of Darwin's finches. Mark and I saw many of those finches during our time there. Darwin sent the finches back, and after he had circled around on that boat, returned back to England, began processing the animals, he noticed that the beaks on those finches were different. He postulated that surely God would not have created 13 different types of finches with 13 different types of beaks. He hypothesized that maybe what happened was an original pair had flown to the islands. They had bred, and that the different conditions there on the islands caused the different beaks. The environment played a role in what was going on, and eventually a word called natural selection came into play, producing 13 different types. Charles Darwin, in his actual writings, he would have little sketches of a tree or a bush-like drawing, which he believed represented what was going on, what he saw there on the islands. One of the things, though, that Charles Darwin forgot to point out in his writings was that in all those times, even all the way up to today, those finches have never been anything other than a finch. He wrote a book, 1859, called The Origin of Species. The full title of that book is often neglected. I'll mention it here just simply to allow you to think about what the true teachings of evolution mean. Full title of that book was The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle of Life. You see, Charles Darwin believed that there was a favored and an unfavored race. And in fact, if you think about it for just a moment, the very theory of evolution is teaching racism. In almost all of the textbooks, we have a hairy, dark-skinned creature coming up out of Africa. And then finally, hundreds of thousands of years later, we have white man, the Caucasian man, evolving out of Europe. And folks, I don't care how you look at it, that is teaching that Caucasian people are further evolved. That we are more superior, so to speak. Folks, that's racism to a T. And yet that's precisely what Charles Darwin bought into. He believed that the Negro race was closer, he said, to the monkeys than the white people. He proposed three mechanisms for how his theory of evolution would work. Number one was acquired characteristics. Acquired characteristics meaning if an animal like a giraffe reaches up into a tree to get the leaves of the tall tree, that he's going to pass that on to his offspring. Now, we know today that's not the case. We know that if an animal loses a leg or has paralysis, he doesn't pass that characteristic on to future generations. Charles Darwin didn't know about DNA. He didn't know about the fact that we have sex cells, sperm and egg. When those chromosomes come together, it produces a new creature. And that the body cells that may have been hurt by paralysis or maybe strengthened by a lot of work, they don't affect those sperm and egg. Acquired characteristics, it's no good. The second one is adaptation. Adaptation is pretty much a vague word. Sounds really good. Polar bear adapts to its environment. We see the white fur, we think snow, it's adapted. Question, what happens if you put a polar bear on a plane, you fly him to the St. Louis Zoo? He adapts again. Adaptation is not a mechanism. The third is natural selection. Survival of the fittest. Now, surprisingly, I don't have a problem with survival of the fittest. In fact, I think it is probably a way that God uses to weed out the unfit. But folks, I do have a problem with people trying to say that survival of the fittest explains the arrival of the fittest. You see, survival of the fittest doesn't change one creature into a different species. What I want to do is I want to examine some of the common evolutionary icons that are used in textbooks. In fact, I want to walk through a National Geographic article that was published just a couple of short years ago, titled, "Was Darwin Wrong?" I simply want to give you their evidence and show you, in fact, just how far off this theory is. The editors start off the article by saying it's a theory that you can take to a bank. In fact, they go on to say, the supporting evidence is abundant, various, ever-increasing, widely interconnected, easily available in museums, popular books, textbooks, and a mountainous accumulation of other peer-reviewed studies. No one needs to and no one should accept evolution merely as a matter of faith. Well, that may sound great and all. When you start actually looking at the evidence they offer, you realize that it's not necessarily a theory you can take to the bank. In fact, the skepticism should start with the very author of this article. They allowed a man by the name of David Quayman to write a 33-page cover story article on Charles Darwin. 33 pages. Now, you would assume that David Quayman is well trained in the field of biology, or maybe he's a microbiologist. And yet the reality, he gave an interview in which he revealed exactly what his training was in. He said, "I did my graduate work on William Faulkner. My training was all in literature, not biology. But when I couldn't make it as a fiction writer," and I would say, by the way, he can make it as a fiction writer, he said, "I turned to this. I liked it more. I get to talk to biologists, walk through rainforests, and see the world." And apparently, that makes him qualified to tell us whether or not Darwin was right or wrong. Ironically, in that same issue of National Geographic, the editors completely missed something in the back of the magazine. They have a section, it was called Who Knew, where they were dealing with those autonomous vehicles. You know, the little cars that don't need any human interaction. In their description of those autonomous vehicles, they give a pretty strong case for intelligent design. I want you to listen to what they said. The autonomous vehicles had trouble figuring out fast enough the significance of obstacles that a 2-year-old human recognizes immediately. Sure, that toddler may not think to wipe spaghetti sauce off her face, but she already knows that when there's a cookie in the kitchen, that she has to climb up to the cabinet, and that when she gets to it, the cookie will taste good. She is more advanced, even in diapers, than any machine humans have devised. Again, if that is not an argument for intelligent design, I don't know what is. The editors of that particular issue of National Geographic try to offer an olive branch to Christians. They start out by saying, humans are not descended from apes, but then Charles Darwin never claimed that we are. If you were to ask an evolutionist outright, do you think we evolved from apes? They would clarify and they would say, no, we came from ape-like creatures. A little technicality. But folks, anybody who's actually read Charles Darwin's writings realizes the foolishness of these editors' statements. He absolutely believed that we came from the old world simian stem of monkeys. In fact, in his book, The Descent of Man, Darwin went on to say, there is no fundamental difference between man and higher mammals in their mental faculties. You see, Darwin absolutely believed that we had evolved from some ape-like creature. What I want to do is I want to look at 6 pieces of evidence that National Geographic offers that Darwin was right. We're going to start with the idea of horse evolution. And they give a beautiful little picture in the magazine. In fact, many of you have probably seen the transition between a very small horse-like animal all the way up to modern-day equus or horses. The small little animal goes by two names, Eohippus or Hyracotherium. And yet, sadly, what those textbooks don't explain, even though most of them have that transitional picture, is that the only place that that really exists, that transition exists, is in the textbook. For instance, Harrub Nielsen, he said, the family tree of the horse is beautiful and continuous only in the textbooks. In the reality provided by the results of research, it is put together from three parts, of which only the last can be described as including horses. In fact, folks, he said that all the way back in 1954. And yet, 50 years later, National Geographic is marching this idea out as evidence that Darwin was right. George Gaylord Simpson said, the uniform, continuous transformation of Hyracotherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. In fact, this has been pointed out so often and so strongly that many textbooks have actually removed the horses and they're now using camels. But what I would point out is who is the publisher of one of these textbooks. It's National Geographic. The second piece of evidence they offer is embryology. Embryology, the study of living things as they're growing in the womb. National Geographic said Darwin wrote the embryo is the animal in its less modified state, and that state reveals the structure of its progenitor. In other words, as you're developing, you're looking like all of the animals that you evolved from. The man who made this very popular was a man by the name of Ernst Haeckel. Now, whether you know it or not, if you've had a general biology class, you've probably seen Haeckel's embryos. Now, they may have been modernized, they may have been colored. Ernst Haeckel produced a series of drawings. For instance, if you look across left to right at the bottom, you've got a fish, a salamander, a turtle, a chicken, a pig, a couple of mammals, and finally a human, at three different evolutionary stages. If you look across the top, you'll notice all of these creatures look basically the same. Ernst Haeckel's point was this. We all evolved from a common ancestor. We all share this evolutionary lineage. What most people don't know is that Ernst Haeckel lived at the same time of Charles Darwin. In fact, he actually visited Charles Darwin there at his home, the Mount, back when Charles Darwin spent many, many days being sick. Haeckel said his turning point in his thinking was when he read Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. That all sounds really good up to now. This sounds like this could be evidence. You've seen the pictures, and yet, folks, those pictures were forged. They were fake, completely made up. Ernst Haeckel lied about his pictures. Now, here's the sad part. That was roughly 200 years ago, and yet we're still putting these pictures in textbooks today. Stephen Jay Gould, who is not exactly a creationist, he was an evolutionist, passed away several years back. He wrote an article in Natural History magazine called Atrocious. And in that magazine article, he dealt specifically with Ernst Haeckel's embryos. I want you to listen carefully to what he said. We should therefore not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered the 19th century textbooks. But we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in large number, if not majority, of modern textbooks. Sir Arthur Keith summed up the case beautifully. He said this. He said it was expected that the embryo would recapitulate the features of the ancestors from the lowest to the highest forms in the animal kingdom. But now that the appearance of the embryo at all stages is known, the general feeling is one of disappointment. The human embryo at no stage is anthropod in appearance. The embryo of the mammal never resembles the worm, the fish, or the reptile. Embryology provides no support whatsoever for the evolutionary hypothesis. And friends, he said that all the way back in 1932. 1932, we recognize Embryology doesn't provide any support for the evolutionary hypothesis, and yet in the year 2004, National Geographic is marching this out as their second piece of evidence that Darwin was right. Number 3, Archaeopteryx. It's a big, funny-looking word. Actually, all you need to remember, this is the creature that allegedly links dinosaurs to birds. Now, I would point out, by the way, that even if this were a true transitional creature, it doesn't explain the fact that we've got flight in several different kinds of creatures. Insect flight, bird flight, mammal flight, i.e. the bats. We've got reptile flight, pterodactyls, pteranodons. If you want to throw in flying fish for fun. And then when you even look at the insect species, you notice there's different types of flight within insects. You've got bumblebees, houseflies, dragonflies. How does evolution explain all of these different methods of flight? Fact of the matter is, it can't. Archaeopteryx is what they toss out in hopes of trying to alleviate some of the stress and strain of flight. They found a fossil many, many years back of this creature that had teeth. It's a bird-like creature. They realized, hey, wait, we don't have birds flapping around today with teeth. Maybe this was the link. And yet, folks, a close inspection reveals this isn't a missing link. When you go to the St. Louis Zoo, you'll find a shrine to Charles Darwin. And in that shrine, they actually have a picture of the Archaeopteryx as evidence, evolution in action. What they don't tell you, though, is that new research has shown that birds lack the embryonic thumb that dinosaurs had, suggesting that it's almost impossible for species to be closely related. In fact, when you look at the difference between a feather and a scale, you don't see any transition. You don't see, for instance, a scatter, a transition from the scale to the feather. What's the truth about Archaeopteryx? Colin Patterson, a senior paleontologist for the British Museum of Natural History, he summed it up this way. He said, Archaeopteryx has simply become a patsy for wishful thinking. He said, is Archaeopteryx the ancestor of all birds? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. There's no way of answering the question. He said, it's easy enough to make up stories of how one form gave rise to another, to find reasons why the stages should be favored by natural selection. But such stories are not a part of science, for there is no way of putting them to the test. Alan Fiducia, one of the world's foremost ornithologists, he said, I conclude that Archaeopteryx was a boreal volant, considerably advanced aerodynamically, probably capable of flapping powered flight to at least some degree. He said Archaeopteryx was, in the modern sense, a bird. In fact, I emailed Alan not too long ago just to make sure that I wasn't misrepresenting him. There had been a lot of articles that came out in the scientific community on this creature, and I wanted to make sure that when I quoted him, that I was quoting him accurately. He emailed me back. I said, I send you warm greetings from Nashville. Are you now in the position that Archaeopteryx was not a bird? He said Archaeopteryx was clearly a well-developed bird with true feathers. In fact, he went on to say that that's all it would be, is simply a bird. Ironically, National Geographic had tried this tactic roughly 5 years earlier. If you ever get the chance, look at the November 1999 issue, where they introduced a new creature called Archaeoraptor. Archaeoraptor, however, evolved in a Chinese farmhouse, where Chinese farmers had taken the front half of a bird, the back half of a dinosaur, they'd glued them together using cement paste, sold them to some unsuspecting American researchers who then published it in National Geographic. The fourth piece of evidence they offer is natural selection. Survival of the fittest. As I mentioned earlier, I don't have a problem with it. In fact, what most people don't know is that it was actually a creationist, a man by the name of Edward Blythe, who came up with, originated the idea of natural selection. It's at this point that we need to make sure everybody understands the difference between micro and macro evolution. Microevolution is true. Microevolution simply is this. You can have small changes within limited parameters. For instance, in this country, we have been breeding dogs for many, many centuries. We've got long-haired dogs, short-haired dogs. We've got sporting dogs. We even now have those little dogs you can put in a purse, little cheesy dogs that people put clothes on. Which, by the way, I would mention, that's not really a dog. Because unless it's got a deep woof voice, that's not a dog. Probably a rodent. But friends, realistically, seriously, in this country, when you breed two dogs, what do you still get? You get a dog. You don't get a fern, you don't get a rhinoceros, you don't get a giraffe, you get a dog. That's microevolution. We can take, for instance, corn plants. We can make hybrids. We can take violets, plants, and get a different variation. We know that. Microevolution is true. Macroevolution, however, is a different story. Macroevolution, also often called organic evolution. And when I use the term evolution, that's precisely what I'm talking about. The idea that we can go from a dog to a different kind of creature. Something we've never seen happen in the laboratory setting. Can natural selection work on the level of microevolution? Absolutely. Can we take two fruit flies and make a different kind of fruit fly? Yeah. Can we make one that's wingless? Yes. Can we make one that's eyeless? Absolutely. Can we ever take a fruit fly and make it into a fern or a virus or a giraffe? The answer is pretty obvious, isn't it? We've never been able to do something like that. Natural selection is true. Swedish biologist Søren Lothrop, he made a beautiful observation. I want you to listen carefully to what he said. He said, micromutations do occur, but the theory that these alone can account for evolutionary change is either falsified or else it's an unfalsifiable, hence metaphysical theory. He said, I suppose that nobody will deny that it's a great misfortune if an entire branch of science becomes addicted to a false theory. But this is what has happened in biology. I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science. When this happens, many people will pose the question, how did this ever happen? I think he's right. Hugo de Vries, a very famous Dutch botanist, he once said, natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest. Folks, he said that over 100 years ago. And yet, this is the fourth piece of evidence that National Geographic is marching out as proof that Darwin was right. Piece number 5. Vestigial structures or vestigial organs. You look at that word and you say, what are those? Friends, those are supposedly organs in your body that you don't need anymore. Things like your appendix, your tonsils. Supposedly, vestigial structures are evolutionary baggage. In fact, if we look all the way back in 1931, humans supposedly had 180 vestigial organs. Of course, that list has pretty much disappeared today because we now know what things do. But I want you to consider for just a moment. All the way back in 1992, we were teaching that vestigial organs was proof of evolution. In fact, if you look at a little timeline, you go all the way back to 1989, textbook says the vestigial tailbone of humans is homologous to the functional tailbone of other primates. Thus, vestigial structures can be viewed as evidence for evolution. We march forward in time to 1994 and we see a picture of a human appendix alongside that of a horse. And again, the idea is this is proof of evolution in action. Finally, we look at that appendix again in 1998. 1998, the Grow Your Encyclopedia said, long regarded as a vestigial organ with no function in the human body, the appendix is now thought to be one of the sites where immune responses are initiated. Walt Brown went on to say its removal also increases a person's susceptibility to leukemia, Hodgkin's disease, cancer of the colon, and cancer of the ovaries. Oh, you mean that the appendix has a structure, a function? Absolutely it does. You know, when I was young, if you got strep throat 3 or 4 times in a row, what would they do? They'd take your tonsils out. They're not as quick to do that anymore because now today we know that the tonsils are the primary initial response of the immune system. The next and last piece of evidence they're going to offer is viruses, bacteria. The idea that bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics. We've all heard about antibiotic-resistant strains. They go by different names. Some hospitals, they call them MRSA, MRSA, multi-resistant Staph aureus, for instance. In the National Geographic article, they say, there is no better or more immediate evidence supporting the Darwinian theory than this process of forced transformation among our amicable germs. This is the best they've got. And yet I want you to remember 3 things about these viruses and bacteria. Number 1, this mutation that allowed these bacteria to be resistant to antibiotics, it didn't happen because somebody was given that particular antibiotic. Let me explain that. If I were to go out and get in a car wreck, I end up in a hospital, they give me IV antibiotics, I wake up 3 days later, they say, we're sorry, Dr. Harrub, you have developed a resistant strain of bacteria. Folks, I didn't get that strain of bacteria simply because they'd given me an IV and it mutated. What happened was they gave me the IV antibiotic that killed all of the normal flora, allowing the resistant strain that was already present to then flourish. In fact, if you want to know where resistant strains of bacteria hang out, it's your local hospital. Number 2, those resistant strains are not very virulent. They don't grow as quickly, which is hardly an argument for survival of the fittest. And last but not least, and most importantly, folks, it's still a bacteria. Regardless of how the bacteria acquired their antibiotic resistance, they are still exactly the same bacteria after receiving the trait as they were before. In other words, it's not vertical macroevolution, but rather it's horizontal microevolution. And folks, that's the best they have. In answering the question, was Darwin wrong? I would say the evidence shows quite clearly, yes, he was. When you really evaluate the evidence for evolution, you realize, folks, it's lacking. It's weak at best. I want to point out one final icon that I think you need to be aware of. Peppered moths are in almost every textbook today. Many of you have seen the images of these light and dark colored moths resting on tree trunks. The story goes like this. Prior to the industrial age, supposedly there were 95% light colored moths, 5% dark, because the birds could easily spot those dark moths. They'd eat them off the trees. And then the industrial age happened. Soot covered the trees, made them dark, and all of a sudden those dark moths had an advantage. And the population shifted to 95% dark, 5% light. That's the story they like to tell our kids. They call this evolution in action. But folks, there's a problem with this little story. Number 1, in over 40 years of research, they've only found 2 moths resting on tree trunks. You say, wait a second, what about those pictures? Oh, those moths are actually pinned or glued to the tree to sell this particular theory. Number 2, in all the research they've done, they never find the moths actually trying to pick a background color that matches their own background. Number 3, most importantly, the man who originally did this research, his last name was Kettlewell. Nobody has been able to replicate his results. Now in science, we call that garbage. And yet, folks, we continue to put this in their textbooks. I want you to listen to a quote given by Bob Ritter, a Canadian textbook writer, when he was asked specifically, why are we still putting information about these peppered moths in the textbooks? Here's what he said. You have to look at the audience. How convoluted do you want to make it for a first-time learner? He said the advantage of this example of natural selection is that it's extremely visual. We want to get across the idea of selective adaptation. Later on, they, talking about high school students, can look at the work critically. In other words, later on, they can discern for themselves whether or not it's accurate or not. Folks, evolution has got some problems. It can't explain how we went from non-living material to living material. It can't explain the original matter in the universe. It can't explain the design that we see out there in nature. and yet we're teaching it as a fact. I say it's time that we bring Darwin back down to earth. We realize that he was just a man who had been trained in theology. And we allow our children to see that there are other options out there, other theories on the origin of species. I encourage you, examine the evidence.